Thank you very much. Borders, of course, is bringing new energy to the life of the book in our country, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this Borders reading series. Thank you. And I thank you all for coming. I'm one of those people who spends most of his life in a room with the door closed, and every couple of years I come out and try to say a word in behalf of a book. And it's a special pleasure, but I have to say there's also a special gravity attached to saying a special word in behalf of this book because it is so personal. God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us. On the cover of the book is a small photograph. Right in here there's a large photograph, of course, that could be the great August 1963 demonstration. It could be the great October 1965 demonstration, or it could be the great November 1967 demonstration. It could be, but it isn't, the June 1996 Stand Up for Children demonstration. I'm actually attached to the fact that it's ambiguous what has gathered these people at the Washington Monument, because all of the things that gather people there are part of this story. But this little photograph shows an Air Force general and his 4-year-old son, and they're both in uniform. I'm wearing a cowboy vest, chaps, and cowboy boots, and I can't quite see whether I'm wearing a gun or not. To say a word or two of introduction to you about this book, what I thought I'd do is just read from it, a little from the beginning, a little from the middle, to give you a flavor for it, and then perhaps we could spend a few minutes talking to each other about the questions or issues it raises. My father. Not until years later did I appreciate how commanding was his presence. As a boy, I was aware of the admiring glances he drew as he walked into the officers' club, but I thought nothing of them. I used to see him in the corridors of the Pentagon where I would go after school and then ride home with him. I sensed the regard people had for him, but I assumed that his warmth and goodness were common to everyone of his rank. I had no way of knowing how unlikely was the story of his success, nor had I any way to grasp the difference between him and the other Air Force generals. He was as tall as they, but to me looked more like a movie actor. I saw him stand at banquet tables, as the speaker at communion breakfasts, at sports teams' dinners, once at a gala German-American friendship dinner in Berlin. His voice was resonant and firm. He approved of laughter and could evoke it easily, though he never told jokes. His mode of public speaking had a touch of the preacher in it. He brought fervor to what he said and an open display of one naked feeling, an unrestrained love of his country. A fluent patriot, a man of power, grace and authority were so much a part of his natural temperament that I did not mark them as such until they no longer characterized him. His relationship with his sons, there were 5 of us, was formal. We addressed him as Sir. We always knew he loved us. The problem was his absolute assumption that the existing social context, the one within which he had found his extraordinary success, was immutable. His belief in the world of hierarchy was total, and his sense of himself as a father and as a general depended on that world's survival. Defending it was his one real passion, his vocational commitment and his religious duty. And yet, one early Sunday morning in winter, when I was perhaps 12 years old, he got up before dawn to drive me on my paper route. This was an unusual occurrence. Normally, I wrestled the papers onto my red wagon, even the thick Sunday editions. I hauled my own way in several cycles around our suburban neighborhood, Holland Hills, a new subdivision of Alexandria, Virginia. But a savage storm had moved in the night before, and now the wind was howling. Sheets of rain and sleet battered the windows. We bundled up, waited inside the front door until my distributor arrived, late, in his panel truck. Then, Dad and I hurried out to load my Washington Stars into the back seat of the Studebaker. The windshield wipers kept getting stuck in the buildup of grainy ice, which we would then scoop away as we returned from running the bulky papers up to the houses of my subscribers. Dad on his side of the street, me on mine. It was raw, unpleasant work, but that morning I loved it. Indeed, in my mind, it was a game, a version of war, which we kids were always playing then. Those dashes from our cars were sorties, bombing runs, commando raids, a stack of papers, artillery shells, mines, grenades, sat between us on the front seat. We would drive for 50 yards, jolt to a stop, snap into action. I would lean toward Dad, pointing through the fogged-up windows. I was the navigator, the bombardier. That one, that one. Then we would each bolt from the car, ducking into the freezing rain, splashing up driveways, across soggy lawns, propping the papers inside storm doors, then dashing away as if the things were going to explode. We achieved a brilliant synchrony, a teamwork that overstamped everything that might ever separate us. Drive, stop, fold, open the door, duck, dash, return. Way to go, sir. If my father had been the commander of a two-man suicide mission, I'd have followed him, not out of any readiness to die, but out of the absolute trustworthiness of what bound us at that moment. That morning was delicious for being just the two of us. When we had almost finished, something hideous happened. My father had run up to a house and dropped the paper and was running back toward the car when the door of the house swung open. "Hey, you!" a voice boomed. Even in that wind, I heard the threat in it. This was on the far side of Holland Hills. My distributor had signed these people up. I didn't know them. The voice was a man's, and it was laced with authority. "Get back here, goddammit!" My father stopped and stood with his back to the man, still facing me. I searched his eyes to see what was in them, but the distance between us and the rain made it impossible to see. "Get your ass back here," I said. "Put my paper where it belongs." I looked across and saw that Dad had dropped the paper under the overhang protruding from the lintel, dry enough, but not quite at the threshold. I thought of making the dash myself to spare us all. But then I saw on a low post beside my father a sign with luminous letters on it. Dad was looking at it too. Master Sergeant John Smith. The man was military. An NCO was barking orders at a general. Again I looked for Dad's eyes, and though it seemed I had found them, I could read nothing of his reaction. Mine was stunned enough for both of us. Caught was the feeling. Captured. Now they shoot us. I was frozen to a spot near the rear bumper of our car. Rain and sleet pelted my face. "Get back here, goddammit!" My father's stare made me sure this was my fault. I started to sprint toward the house to retrieve the paper and apologize. But as I was about to pass Dad, he put his hand up and stopped me. He turned, and with that low humping movement, ducking gunfire, he retraced his path up the sergeant's driveway, dodging rivulets, scooting past a wheelbarrow and a mound of topsoil. Sergeant Smith's car was off to the side, and now I saw the bumper sticker, identifying it with Fort Belvoir, an army post a few miles away. The sergeant had remained in the shadow of the doorway, out of the weather. He held the storm door half open. I could see only his arm and the dark bulk of his body. He was a big man. I had collected at his house once or twice, but from his wife. In the short time they had been on my route, they never complained. I took a step forward as Dad bent to pick up the newspaper. He brought it the 2 or 3 steps to the door, held it out, And the man took it, saying something that I could not hear. Then Dad was running toward me again, pumping like a halfback. "In the car," he called. I scooted around to my side, and when he leapt onto the front seat, so did I, as if we had just pulled one off together. Our doors shut simultaneously. Dad dropped the car into gear, popped the clutch, and we lurched forward away. "What did he say, Dad?" I asked, but I was afraid of the answer. "He said," Dad looked at me and I still could not read him. "He said, 'Don't let it happen again, bub.'" "Well, what did you say?" I said, "No, sir." His face cracked open with pleasure, sheer triumph. "Sir, even I knew how senior NCOs hated it when stupid punk recruits addressed them as if they were officers." "No, sir," Dad repeated. Then we laughed and laughed, heads back. He slapped my leg. "No, sir." I was swept up in a wave of gratitude, both that my father had not needed to pull rank on the bastard and that he had found a way to prick him. Our overlarge reaction was about more than that, and now I know why. The order of the hierarchy of the universe we shared had just been upended. Years later in literature class, I would learn that such reversal is the essence of comedy, also of tragedy. But that morning, bound more tightly than before, my father and I found his near humiliation and his sly but finally generous riposte only funny. Nothing would ever seem this funny to us again. Certainly not the ordered world, as eventually I upended it. But that morning, it was enough. We laughed until we got home, then found ourselves unable to explain to the others why, which only made it better. And so something from the middle, the beginning of chapter 5, which is called Joy to My Youth. Introibo ad altare Dei, the priest says at the beginning of Mass. I will go unto the altar of God. Ad Deum qui laetificat juventutem meam, the altar boy replies, to God who gives joy to my youth. One night we are cruising along the ridge of South Capitol Street above the River Plains city of Washington, D.C. It is the summer of 1960. Kennedy nominated on first ballot, the headline blared this morning. Below it another read, Moscow bids UN convene at once on RB-47 incidents. Dad has worked late at the Pentagon and earlier has let his driver go. I have driven across the Potomac to pick him up. I'm a hotshot college kid now, and for the summer a cryptanalyst aide at the FBI, a job Dad got me. But I am not so worldly as to pass up the chance to take the Lincoln out at night, or to be alone with him. The headlines have steadily charted the ratcheting up of tensions between our country and the Soviet Union. Khrushchev warns of rocket attack on bases used by U.S. spying planes, one read earlier this week. Khrushchev establishes new deadline, this time if the Allies fail to withdraw from Berlin. The Soviet leader says he will close its access routes through East Germany. GIs will go in behind tanks. A war will start. We will quickly drop our atom bomb on Moscow. They will drop theirs on this city here, the one outside our window. What a view we have of the twinkling lights of Ground Zero. The road takes us along the edge of a plateau. To our left and above are the looming turrets of St. Elizabeth, where the traitor poet Ezra Pound has been locked up nuts for a decade. To our right, across the blue runway lights of Anacostia Naval Air Station, is the Potomac River, and in the distance, the similar lights of National Airport. I know that Khrushchev's threats are what have kept Dad so late at the Pentagon. When he finally came out, he surprised me by letting me stay at the wheel, which he had never done before. Instead of taking my place, he got in next to me, a passenger. I was glad to have the chance to show him how well I had learned to drive. Both hands on the wheel now, of course. No finger steering, no arm across the backrest. Up ahead are the gleaming runway lights of yet another airport, Bolling Air Force Base, where we have lived since returning from Germany, and where my mother and father and brothers will live for the next decade. Westmoreland Avenue, General's Row, a gracious house next door to Vice Chief Curtis LeMay. There is a buzzer under the dining room rug for summoning the orderly to clear the dishes. There is a red telephone, which will ring when the war begins. There is a pool table in the rec room. When we pull through the main gate, an air policeman will salute us because of the stars on the front bumper. He salutes even when it is just me, and I salute back as if I am the general. Behind us, the Washington Monument and Capitol Dome are still illuminated, so I know it is not yet midnight. Tonight, Dad is in a somber mood. He is smoking, flicking ashes out the window. He has said nothing. Finally, he crushes the cigarette in the dashboard ashtray and turns to me. Son, I want to say something to you. I'm only going to say it once. And I don't want you asking me any questions, okay? You read the papers. You know what's going on in Berlin. The bomber they shot down last week. I may not come home one of these nights. I might have to go somewhere else. The whole air staff would go. If that happens, I'm going to depend on you to take my place with Mom and the boys. What do you mean? Mom will know, but you should know too. I'll want you to get everybody in the car. I'll want you to drive south. Get on Route 1, head to Richmond, go past it. Go as far as you can before you stop. He didn't say anything else. As I remember it, neither did I. We must have driven the rest of the way home in silence. I do remember very distinctly, though, the two halves of what I felt. The first was fear. I began to be afraid that night, and I stayed afraid for many years. First of what our enemy would do, later of what we would. The second thing I felt was an unprecedented intimacy with him. The trust he placed in me had less to do with the prospect of that drive down Route 1 than with his readiness to let me see his fear. I felt a rare happiness in the car with him that night. The wish only to be what I already was, a father-pleasing son. And then, although it's always impossible to mark the change to one moment, here is a moment when the change began to happen. Less than a month after the Pope's visit to the United Nations, on November 2nd, 1965, 2 years to the day after the murders of the No brothers in Saigon, a 31-year-old Baltimore man set out for a drive with his infant daughter. Saying goodbye to his wife, he added the question, "What can I make them do to stop the war?" As a new father, the man was particularly upset by the deaths of Vietnamese children caused by the American bombs. From Baltimore, he drove to Washington and then across the Potomac into Arlington. It was rush hour when he pulled into the parking lot at the Pentagon. Still holding his daughter, he poured kerosene onto his clothes. At the last moment, he put the baby aside, then struck a match on his shoe, igniting himself. His name was Norman Morrison. He died quickly. Immediately above Morrison was the third-floor office of Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara, who, according to his biographer Deborah Shapley, noticed, quote, "When a column of orange flame leapt 12 feet high, McNamara went to his window and, realizing what had happened, was stunned. Years later, he told Shapley, 'The suicide was a personal tragedy for me.'" In his memoir, McNamara would write about Morrison's death, quote, "I reacted to the horror of his action by bottling up my emotions, and I avoided talking about them with anyone, even my family. I knew Marg and our 3 children shared many of Morrison's feelings about the war, as did the wives and children of several of my cabinet colleagues. And I believed I understood and shared his thoughts. There was much Marg and I and the children should have talked about. Yet at moments like this, I often turn inwards. It is a grave weakness. The episode created tension at home that only deepened as dissent and criticism of the war continued to grow." I cannot read McNamara's words now without wanting to take them as an expression of my father's feelings, even if he never admitted to them. My father's office was down the hall from McNamara's, so perhaps he saw that pillar of fire too. At the time, I wanted to call my father, as much to console him for the shock he must have felt, I think, as to seek help in dealing with my own. But I was afraid to call. Kook was a word I had heard my dad apply to protesters. Confused as I was by Morrison's act, it would have been unbearable to hear him dismissed as that, even if my father were to do so out of his own version of McNamara's bottled up emotion. A few weeks later, at Christmas, I went to General's Row at Bolling Air Base. I was in the Roman Catholic Seminary in Washington, D.C. by this time. I had already had one turkey dinner at midday, but I got the special permission needed to leave the seminary after the big seminary meal. Mom delayed the family meal for me. As the orderly began to serve us, my 4 brothers and parents and I laughed about my second supper, but a somber mood inevitably fell over the table. Our thin chat about the Redskins and the bowl games subtly underscored the thick subject of which no one dared to speak. My brother Joe was still severely crippled from his polio, decidedly classified 4F. Brian was home from college, an athlete, an all-round fun guy. Dennis was a senior in high school. His hair was too long for my parents' taste, but he had quietly defied their orders to cut it, and today no one was going to make an issue of it. Kevin was in early high school, but he could have been an infant for the uncomplicated affection in which we all held him. Presiding at one end of the table was Mom, and at the other, Dad. At this dinner table, in the past, back when Berlin was its flashpoint self, we would sit arrayed like this, and occasionally the red telephone in our parents' bedroom would ring, with its shrill auxiliary bell sounding in the kitchen. The sergeant would push open the swinging door, an alert new blade of light in his eyes. No cook now, no servant, but an aide-de-camp, a general's man. Dad would touch his napkin to his mouth, get up without a word. The hotline to the Pentagon rang for only one of 2 reasons: to announce the start of a war or to test the system. When the phone rang at dinner time, Dad would disappear, and a stark silence would settle on the table. Even little Kevin seemed to know what was never more than an inch below the surface of this life. Me, especially after that night in 1960. I always expected Dad to disappear after kissing us each quickly, then going away forever. What always happened instead was that Mom would break the silence with a simple order. Eat your potatoes, Jimmy. Elbow off the table, Kevin. Saying in effect, eat, live, be alive. And that is what she was doing now, helping the orderly to put heaping platters on the table. When the sergeant had disappeared into the kitchen, my father looked over and he asked me to say grace. A first. Heat rushed to my face, but I bowed my head and recited the road offering. Improvised prayers had come into vogue, but I knew better than to try that here. Nevertheless, the familiar words I spoke unleashed other words, and despite myself, and especially despite my mother's clear wish, I turned to my father as we all finished crossing ourselves, all but Dennis, who had not touched a hand to his forehead or his heart, and I blurted, "Dad, what did you think when that man died at the Pentagon?" His eyes filled with sadness that I had seen before. They were hard on me. I felt the weight of his judging disapproval. Mom, serving plates, broke in sharply. "We're not discussing that. We don't need to discuss it, Mary, but Jimmy has a right to an answer." Dad stared at me and he spoke slowly. "What do we all want? The end of the war, right?" "Right," I said, grateful that his voice sounded so calm, which seemed a concession. Already, without knowing it, I was accepting the stereotypes of the peaceniks. This was no warmonger, this was Dad. He leaned toward me to make a statement. Not a discussion, not an argument, a statement. "The war will end," he said, "when the communists see it's futile to resist us. That's why we've gone in so strong, a quick, strong attack, a bloody nose, bang, now." And here's the point. Protests like Norman Morrison's, however sincerely motivated, or like the kooks who burn the flag. I don't believe in burning the flag, Dad. Like the kooks who burn the flag, they send exactly the wrong message to Hanoi. They give the communists reason to keep fighting. Does that promote peace or postpone it? Postpone it, I guess. So does that answer your question? Yes, sir, I said, convincing myself it had. And that was it. Christmas dinner, 1965, on General's Row, Westmoreland Avenue, Bolling Air Force Base. Except for this. In the silence, after my father's efficient statement, Mom began to serve a plate for Dennis. He reached across and stopped her. "No turkey, Mom," he said. "What do you mean, no turkey?" "I'll have potatoes and the beans. I love your beans. I don't eat meat." "You what?" We all stared at him. I was amazed at how cool he was, sitting with his hair down nearly to his collar, not even blushing. "I'm a vegetarian," he said, so simply, a first-time declaration, devoid of anger, yet a firm response, I saw at once, to that season of blood, so clear, so uncomplicated, so true, and so unlike me. How I envied him. Dennis would not eat meat again, ever. I would envy him often. Me, I was eating turkey for the second time that day. And the rest is history. Our history, I suspect. Your turn. Comments, questions? Thoughts? Yes, sir.
In the book, you touched on the Catholic.
A little louder, maybe, so they can hear you. Sorry.
In the book, you write about the effort to depict Vietnam as a Catholic country and
yes.
Catholics' particular responsibility for all that came.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
In the book, I refer to the Catholic piece of the Vietnam story. One of the most surprising things that Robert McNamara reveals in his memoir that was published last year is that when he became Secretary of Defense, he says, he was under the impression that Vietnam was a Roman Catholic country. That mistake at that level of the American government is crucial to understanding what happened. It's also crucial to understanding my story and the story of a whole generation of Catholics. In fact, Vietnam in 1961, when Robert McNamara became a Secretary of Defense, was less than 10% Roman Catholic. It was a Buddhist country. The first time most Americans heard of Vietnam was when Buddhist monks immolated themselves on the streets of Saigon in June of 1963. Some of you may remember it. They immolated themselves as an act of protest against the policy of the Saigon government, which made it illegal for Buddhists to fly the Buddhist flag on Buddha's birthday. Why? Because the government of Saigon was an Inquisition Catholic government, presided over by Ngo Dinh Diem, his brother Nu, whom you may remember, and their other brother, Tuk, who was the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Saigon. And their repression of the Buddhists was a more igniting factor in the conflict of the Vietnam War, I believe, than the conflict with the communists. Certainly, the American failure to understand the nature of the country, we thought it was a war between communists and Catholics. We didn't know about the Buddhists, is crucial to understanding the terrible mistakes that we then made. It's a deep, deep tragedy. Cardinal Spellman was a friend of my mother and father's. In fact, he was very special in my mother's story because he was the military vicar of the United States military, and my father was one of the senior general officers who was a Roman Catholic. And my mother was the president of something called the Military Council of Catholic Women, which brought her into a relatively intimate association occasionally with Cardinal Spellman. She loved him. His support for her enabled her, a young working girl from the south side of Chicago who didn't graduate from the 8th grade, to survive and succeed among the aristocrats of Washington, D.C., among whom she found herself very surprisingly as a young woman. So Spellman was a very precious figure, and when my mother was dying, she only made one request of us, which was that when she was laid out at the wake, that she have just she wanted to wear the medal that Cardinal Spellman had given to her in acknowledgement for her contribution. It was that important. She longed for the day when Cardinal Spellman would ordain me to the priesthood. Cardinal Spellman traditionally ordained the Paulist Fathers in New York. Through 1965, 66, 67, I began to feel quite differently about it all. Ironically enough, beginning with Pope Paul VI, who you may remember came to the city of New York in 1965 in October to address the General Assembly of the United Nations. He was Spellman's guest. This should have been the greatest moment in Cardinal Spellman's life, the first visit of a pope to America. Cardinal Spellman at the height of his power. Cardinal Spellman introduced Pope Paul VI to President Johnson in a suite in the Waldorf Astoria. And then the Pope announced that he wanted to meet with the President privately. And no one knows for sure what the Pope said to the President, but we can assume that there was some indication of his feeling about the President's then 7-month-old war. Because by October of 1965, President Johnson, who took office the previous January as the peace candidate, had 200,000 soldiers in Vietnam. And the war, Operation Rolling Thunder, the air war, was underway. And when the Pope went before the General Assembly, he gave a resounding speech that was a denunciation of war, a very clear repudiation of Lyndon Johnson and Cardinal Spellman. That was a month before Norman Morrison's act, to which I just referred. A week after Norman Morrison ignited himself at the Pentagon, a man named Roger Laporte went out in front of the United Nations and ignited himself. Norman Morrison was a Quaker. Shocking as the deed was, it came into our world only this far. Roger Laporte was a member of Dorothy Day's Catholic worker community in New York. And his last words were, "I'm against the war. I am doing this as a religious act," which went right through a whole generation of young Catholics. How could this be a religious act? And at Laporte's funeral, a young, almost young priest gave a eulogy in which he refused to condemn the act as a mortal sin of suicide, in which he said there was something good to come out of what Roger Laporte had done, which infuriated Cardinal Spellman. And he banished the priest from New York, and that priest's name was Daniel Berrigan. And it was the uproar that greeted that banishment that made Daniel Berrigan famous, which is the beginning of the Catholic peace movement. So in an odd, strange way, the Vietnam War begins when Cardinal Spellman introduces Notre Dame to the power figures of Washington in the early 50s. And the Catholic peace movement begins when Cardinal Spellman banishes Daniel Berrigan in 1965 after Roger Laporte's act. But I believe those acts are sequential, consequential. Roger Laporte, consequent to Norman Morrison, and I believe in some way consequent even, perhaps, to the Pope's statement against the war. And when I asked my father what he made of the Pope's statement, he said to me the very thing I would be saying years later, not about war, but about matters of sexual morality. The Pope is naive, he said. Which, coming from my father, who was committed above all to hierarchy, was a shocking turn. Sorry to, it's another whole part of the theme of the story. God, my father, and the war that came between us, it's all convoluted for people like me. Someone else? Yes, sir.
To switch gears, would you be willing to talk about Patrick, your friend Patrick, reading 2 bits? When you were at the novitiate, it was
yes.
Meeting, and then he ended after he died.
Well, Patrick is, one of the mysteries is what happens when a young man full of robust feeling for life and energy and hope and, enters the Roman Catholic Seminary. And the thing that happened to me was I discovered friendship. And in fact, my discovery of friendship among Paulists, which was the order I joined, lasts until this day. Some of the people in this room are friends I made then. Patrick was in my class, and he was my best friend. And you're referring to a scene where I described, in this the odd world of the seminary where there are no women, and this was in 1962 or 62 when, not much had changed really since the Middle Ages. We're talking about a discipline of life that goes back to the Council of Trent. Poverty, chastity, obedience, no money, no freedom. Every move you make is controlled. And so you begin to be a little strange, and the strangeness in our life took the form that we used to wager desserts. It was the major form of excitement in our life. Desserts became our currency. And so the experience of wealth, human beings are innately greedy, I would say. We would accumulate desserts. And you couldn't eat them all at once, so you'd have people owing you desserts. It'd be kind of banking system. And we would bet on anything. And one day, what you're referring to is this scene where we're watching, it's in November, perhaps early November, late October, I don't know. The group of us in our cassocks are standing by the edge of this lake out in the wilderness of New Jersey, where we are for a year and a day. And somebody says, I wonder when the lake is going to freeze. And somebody says, it'll freeze around, Christmas. And somebody else says, no, it'll freeze before that. And pretty soon it's back and forth. And suddenly, Patrick says, I'll bet it freezes by December 8th. Now, and he picked December 8th. He had a certain weakness for Feast of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And that was the feast of something. The Immaculate Conception. December 8th. So, and suddenly people are betting that, and within minutes, Pat has 25 desserts riding on whether that lake is going to be frozen or not. And so then this experience began of every day after chapel, slipping down to the lake to see how, and as the weather temperature would fall, and sure enough, by the 1st of December, there's this little thin glaze of ice, and the 2nd of December, it's a little thicker, and then there's a thaw, and then people, you know, and people are, and I'm thinking, poor Pat, he'll never have dessert again this whole year. That's it, you know. December 8th comes, and there's this glaze of ice across the lake. We gather, there's great attention to it. Someone picks up a rock and drops it on the ice, and the ice holds. And everybody goes, oh, no. And someone else picks up a bigger rock, and it goes through the ice, which was a great relief to everybody. And I stepped on the ice. I remember quite distinctly stepping, and my foot went through and got wet. And I look back, and there's Pat sitting there lacing up. Oh, I'm important detail. He said, I will skate across this ice on December 8th. That's what the bet was. I will skate across this ice. So I look over, and there's Pat lacing up his skates. And I said, Pat, you can't do that. And he didn't listen to anybody. And he took a little run up the hill, and then, boom, launched himself on this ice. And as we were, well, as some of us were afraid at that point, the ice cracked. It wasn't ready to be skated on yet. And the amazing thing, it was a moment of true revelation in my life. And this story came back to me when his wife asked me to preach his eulogy years later. It came back to me because what happened was Pat skated across the ice ahead of the break, skating so swiftly and so deftly that he had the weight, he had enough ice to hold the weight for the instant he needed it. And he skated across the ice, and we watched this crack open up behind him. And he went all the way across a big, good-sized lake. So that by the and as I recount the story here, and for me it's a vivid symbol of what the power of this brotherhood was, and this community to which we had found ourselves committed. And by the time he got across the lake, I can remember this feeling of, I don't know much, but I know I want to be with this man. And it was a kind of click for me about my life. And then I was with him. And he was my dearest friend through the seminary, and then we wound up priests together, and we were in the peace movement together, and he was really important to me. And then he died of a heart attack. He left the priesthood before I did. I was crushed when he left the priesthood because this brotherhood was so wounded by his absence from it. And then I followed him out of the priesthood. But we were, and then, you know, we were still quite close. When Lexa and I got married, he took the pictures at our wedding. He was our daughter's godfather, and he's our son's namesake. And he died of a heart attack in 1980. One of those odd things. But his friendship was a true revelation to me. Why did you ask?
I loved it. And I love the eulogy. I wish you'd read that. I don't know if you're reluctant. Maybe it's too hard for you to actually do that in public. But I wish you would put a period to the story. I think what you say about him, the metaphor you have about, I don't want to spoil it, but you say it in the eulogy. I think it's beautiful writing.
Well, what I refer to in the eulogy, of course, is that story becomes, of course, I understand. The greatest thing about Pat, the thing that was so wonderful about him, was he truly believed he was loved, which made him such a pleasure to be with, because then he could make you feel that way. And for him, it was very much about his religious faith. And in preaching the eulogy, what you're referring to, I couldn't find it easily. I'm not sure how to read it, actually, but I would say that what happened in that moment was I realized, of course, this was very much an image of Christ walking on the water. And that wonderful, because that's a wonderful image of the trust, the lightness that comes with trust, and it's all about trust. And Patrick was the kind of person who, you know, some of us are born to worry, and some are born to trust, it seems, and he was born to trust. Perfect antidote to me. Anyone else? Yes?
In writing this, it's so different, of course, than a novel. And I'm wondering what kind of labor goes into that?
What's the difference between writing something like this and writing a novel and the labor? Yes?
That goes into the polished phrase and just choosing the right word and the right sentiment.
Well, there's the work of memory, but I must say, in my experience, the fact that I had written 9 novels before taking this on was enormously important, because I had learned the skill of narrative form, of shaping narrative form, of making it. By that I mean, you know, to understand that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, that it's out of the chaos of these events to draw order out of them, which is what the form of the story does. And it's a skill, it's a craft. One can learn it. For example, this story begins, it fell open for me when I realized the beginning and the end. It begins when my father, a young FBI agent in Chicago in 1942, with a relatively limited future, his future explodes open with possibility when he is the arresting agent of a notorious Chicago gangster named Roger Toohey, who was the last of the Chicago kidnappers and murderers who was at large. He had escaped from Joliet prison. He wasn't guilty of a federal crime. So what was an FBI agent going to charge him with? My father arrested him and became famous for doing so when he charged him with failure to notify his draft board of a change of address when he escaped out of prison. So it was a draft violation. You see, that's the beginning of the story. And Hoover noticed my father, and the rest of my father's life follows from that. Soon 2 weeks later, I'm born, and a few months later, we're in Washington. And he's an FBI agent in Washington, and next he's an Air Force officer who's in charge of espionage and security for the Air Force, etc. That's the beginning of the story. The end of the story is when this man whose life begins with a draft violation has a son who's a draft resistor, my brother Dennis. And it's the same relationship. My father, however, instead of being the prosecutor, becomes the defense attorney for his son, because my brother asked my father to be his lawyer when he came in from the cold. And my father did it. Well, you see, it's the beginning and it's the end. Aristotle says that the form of the story exists to reverse the beginning by the end. And the reversal has taken place. Not only has my father, out of paternal loyalty, stood with his son. This is in the early 70s. The war is still on. My father's retired by now, but nevertheless, he wears his uniform, 3 stars, to defend my brother. Not just out of loyalty, but as he said to someone, I heard him say it, because his son's act might represent the hope for human beings to change the way they resolve their conflicts. Because if we keep doing it the way we do it, we won't survive the century, he said. So I talked earlier about the upending of a world. It wasn't just my world that was upended. That's the point of this book in its way. It's the American world. My father's generation, my generation, everyone really. So that's the beginning, there's the end. Once I saw those 2 moments in tension with each other, I had the story. I should add here, by the way, that the tension is ratcheted up by the fact that my other brother, Brian, the athlete and all-around fun guy I referred to, becomes an FBI agent, catching draft dodgers, just as Dennis becomes a draft dodger. Well, Maybe we have time for one more. Well, a couple more. Yes.
You may discuss it in your book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but having such an authoritative figure who's almost godlike in many ways and has answers, in rejecting some of his perspective, does it take a lifetime to reconstruct your own perspective, or is that an ongoing process, or when did that begin and end?
Well, it's a very difficult question. I isolate in the title, The War. I mean, of course, this is a deeply human story because every generation has to, in some way, separate itself from the generation ahead. It's an Oedipal story. So there's a kind of classic mythic quality to it. It's everybody's story. But in this case, it's all around this war. And the war forced me to change. It forced me to make decisions that I would never have made otherwise. Which is, at the end, why I say the war is holy to me. I don't know what to say about it beyond that, except to say that one of the tragedies of that war is that it took so long. It was a 15-year-long war. But because it took so long, many of us were able, slowly, because it's the only way we could do it, to complete the business of transformation. So that by 1975, when the war finally ended, with the fall of Saigon, the American phase of this war at least, many of us were changed. We would never go back. One of the ironies of my life, and I only see it later when I look back, is that I entered the Paulists to the month when John Kennedy sent the first advisors to Vietnam. And I left the Paulists to the week. By that I mean my final letter to the Pope asking dispensation for my vows, to the week of the fall of Saigon. So that the brackets of my time as a member of this religious order, and really that's the time of my transformation, are the war. And the war has become, Vietnam is a country, it's not a war, and it's very narcissistic of America to always refer to Vietnam only in relationship to what it did to us. But nevertheless, it lives as the powerful symbol of our unfinished business as a people, because we haven't, as a people, finished that transformation. And that's what it meant when we all went so berserk at Robert McNamara last year. Why was there such a storm of reaction to his memoir? It's because we're all still grappling with the experience of that. Not just that war, but everything that was part of it. The Democrats are going to have their convention this summer for the first time since 1968 in Chicago. And I suggest that around that event, we're going to be all casting back our minds to what it meant, those months of 1968, which were, those are the pivot, that's the pivot season. Around that 4-month period, a world turned, never to be the same again. Yes, sir?
Just a brief question about the craft of writing and your gifts as a writer. I read American Requiem and Memorial Bridge back to back. I read American Requiem first and then read Memorial Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's like you need both of those stories to get a complete picture of who you are as a writer in your relationship with your father and your mother. Because you just told a story that's in, I think it's in the novel, as opposed
about the draft.
About the draft of your
Right.
father defending your brother.
Right.
But how do you separate out what is literal fact and what is truth about your life?
Right.
And your memory, it must be, do you know for sure what happened in your life, or in terms of how you presented Memorial Bridge, what part of that's fiction and what part of that's fact?
Right.
And what part of it is literal in American Requiem and what part is truth?
Right.
You know what I mean?
I do. It's an important question. For me, the difference between Memorial Bridge and American Requiem mainly is that I'm not in Memorial Bridge. It's very much the story of my brother Dennis and my father. I'm in it, of course, and it's an attempt to imagine the story, mostly from Sean's point of view, the father. Memorial Bridge prepared me to write American Requiem in that sense, that I made this act of imagination to enter the world of the father in that story. What was his experience? So that was really what that was. It prepared me for it. American Requiem is very much my story. It's not an autobiography, it's a memoir. And the difference, I believe, between autobiography and memoir is that memoir is organized around one or two large experiences or feelings. So this is organized very much around the war and its relationship to religious faith. That's the turning. It is an act of memory, but an act of memory is always an act of imagination. And you have to make an act of faith in yourself that you are capable of remembering things as they are true, which doesn't mean necessarily that you're capable of remembering things exactly as that camera might have recorded them happening. And memory is fallible. I discovered, to my embarrassment recently, for example, that I remembered Roger Toohey's nickname as Tough. I think it was probably terrible. I've been one person said that to me. I thought, no, I couldn't have made such a basic mistake. And then somebody else said it to me, and I thought, whoa. But the first thing I did when I finished the manuscript was give this book to my brothers. And my wife read it, and a couple of other friends read it. And one of the issues for me was test how I remember this. Does anything seem off or false or untrue to you? And actually, there were a couple of points that I reconsidered as a result of that feedback. If I could have given it to every reader in a way and said, help me to finish this, one might finally end up with a work of pure science. But it isn't. It's in a work of imagination, finally. I'm completely confident that the truth of it is my truth. The details, I'm confident that, as confident as I can be as a fallible person, that the details are right, too. But I expect that I'll learn some other mistakes as well. But the truth of the feeling is as close to the truth as I'll ever get about anything. The truth of the feelings. Well, one last question, perhaps. Yes?
I just have to ask that in your novel, Mortal Prince, you have one of the characters describing McNamara as one that took the soup, whose family took the soup.
Mm-hmm.
And in American Requiem, you have your mom
Right.
telling the same story. I've never heard that story before I read it in Mortal Prince, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on it.
Well, it's my mother's story. I never heard it either. I've never heard it anywhere, except it's part of the lore of my mother's family. What the gentleman is referring to is the fact that I actually said to my mother, Robert McNamara, he must be a Catholic, or why isn't he a Catholic? This was probably in the early 60s. And my mother said, somebody in his family took the soup. And I said, what's that? And she said, well, during the hunger, the British government brought soup to people in villages, but it was offered to them through the Church of Ireland, the Protestant parish. And in order to get it, you had to be a member of the parish. You had to be a Protestant. And villages where so taking the soup became shorthand for becoming a Protestant to get the soup. And then my mother added, any village where anybody took the soup was then forever cursed. And the curse was, no son of that village would ever get a vocation to the priesthood. And I can remember when my mother said that, I thought, oh God, can we leave the priesthood thing alone here? But then when I wrote Prince of Peace, this so struck me that when I wrote Prince of Peace and was reading about Vietnam, one of the things that really appalled me about the Inquisition repressiveness of the Ngo Dinh Diem family in its attempt to convert Buddhists to Catholicism was that some of the aid that was given through the government of Saigon when it was made available in the countryside was contingent on people being baptized. And there's a scene in Prince of Peace where Michael Maguire comes into a village and finds that there's one long line. At one end of the line is the table where the rice bowls are being given out. And at the other end of the line is the priest baptizing people. And, well, we have to stand against such things wherever they occur, but let me just end by thanking you for being here, thanking you, Paul, and any of you from St. Paul's who are here. The love of the Paulists that we have in common makes us especially precious. But I'd like to close, if you indulge me, by reading the last page of this book. I gave you the beginning and the middle, and I'd like to close by giving you the very end. It takes place immediately after we have buried my father. He died in the middle of the Persian Gulf War in January of 1991. And we've just buried him at Arlington National Cemetery. The earth had opened under me, my personal abyss. I was staring in. Yes, I saw the bombs. Yes, I saw the war-induced end of history. Yes, I saw it all in the death of my father. War had come down to war between us. I saw the lesson of it clear. We both lost. Every ounce of abstraction has been purged from what war means to me, what war does, what it is. No one wins. Victory is impossible. Victory is meaningless. Victory is a lie. Victory is another name for murder. And that is why, as a citizen of a nation still hell-bent on achieving victory, I am and always will be nervous, afraid, a desperate father, a permanent pacifist. The broadly political is always personal for me and always religious. Doubt is at the heart of my faith, as objection is at the heart of my loyalty. Such is the structure of my patrimony, my curse and blessing both. But it is a patrimony I wish I could have given him, a father and a son at war. But at last, this way to see us not at war. I have the story to tell about the two of us, and he never did. The story is a victory over the need to be victorious. These have been my words, but it was his life that gave me mine. At last I have this belief from him: in despair is the beginning of hope, not the end, which is why this particular war was holy and why this story is sacred. My father was dead, a fallible man, a noble man. I loved him. And because I was so much like him, though appearing not to be, I had broken his heart. And the final truth was, oh, how the skill of ending with uplift yet eludes me. He had broken mine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all again for being here, and of course we will be very happy to sign your books. We're bringing a table over right now, and we'll put it right here, and I'm happy to sign whatever you have books here if there's some that you don't have. And again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much.
Lexa, could I ask you to hold that? Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you were here. I appreciate it, really.
Thanks.
Good luck to you.
I never heard anyone else tell the story of the soup.
I never did either.
I asked you that.
I never did either. It's interesting. I'd forgotten that I used it in Mortal Friends, too.
I've waited for you to come here. I'm from Quincy.
How are you? What's your name?
Michael Haskins.
Michael, look at you.
I used to work on the Record American when it was in
Did you?
Winthrop Square.
Did you? Indeed so.
What a fan.
Wow. Wow, look at this. Do you have a pen I could borrow?
Yes, Richard.
Stupidly, I came.
Fairly black Sharpie and a
Oh, great, black.
Nice
I'll-
fairly
Nice.
sharp blue.
Oh, okay,
Rather
great.
that
Great.
type of pen.
No, this is fine. Is this okay?
Yeah, just